Detecting signals in SETI presents an interesting problem. It's no longer a matter of looking at a printout and circling an interesting signal, but in fact with modern technology now covers millions of channels and many different frequencies, requiring a way to weed through those signals both through the work of citizen scientists or through computers determining if a signal is interesting enough for someone to take a look at all, increasingly so. SETI is becoming a complicated business as our capabilities to search increase, but the payoff increases. My guest today has come up with a mathematical way to look at those signals, perhaps far more efficiently than anything used before. It's called the KLT, and may well lead us to the detection of a signal from an alien civilization.
Welcome to Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by SETI astronomer Dr. Claudio Maccone. He is the Director for Scientific Space Exploration, as well as the Chair for the SETI Permanent Committee at the International Academy of Astronautics. In 2002, he was awarded the Giordano Bruno Award by the SETI League for his efforts to establish a radio observatory on the far side of the Moon. Claudio earned his BSc in Physics at the University of Turin in 1972 and his MSc in Physics at the University of Turin in 1974. He earned his PhD at the Department of Mathematics at the University of London King's College in 1980. He has published nearly 100 scientific and technical papers, most of which in Acta Astronautica. The asteroid 11264 was named Claudio Maccone in his honor by the International Astronomical Union.
Dr. Claudio Maccone, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Doctor, what drew you from mathematics and astrophysics to SETI?
Well, okay, yeah, good question. Thank you. No problem to answer that. So the point is that I decided to be a physicist about the age of 20, something like that. So I registered for a degree, but not a PhD, degree in physics at the University of my town, which is Torino in Italian, Turin in English. Unfortunately, no, because of the Shroud of Turin, but I'm not going to talk about that. So anyway, this is where I got my PhD, my degree in physics first and in 72 and in mathematics in 74. Then I went to King's College, London, UK, to do a PhD in mathematics, in applied mathematics, not pure mathematics. And that was great. I learned a lot. Well, first of all, I had to learn English because English is not my mother tongue, of course, but that I think I did. And after that, I came back home also because I had two parents that were aging. I was the only child. And in Italy, we have this tradition that the good children grown up and finally they take care of their parents until the end. So I was a good child and I did take care of my parents until the end. In the meantime, however, I had to look for a job. And I was lucky because in my town, Turin is an industrial town. Basically, you may know about Fiat, the car factory and so on. So in this town, I was lucky to find a company at that time called Alenia Spazio. Spazio means space, doing research in space mission, doing two kinds of space mission, actually. The scientific space mission, that is the space mission that I was really interested in, and the parts of the International Space Station that nowadays are flying around the Earth. So to make the story short, I spent 20 years of my life in this company. So it was a company job, not an academic job. And you may be surprised that a guy coming from a company finally turned to SETI. But, if the guy is open-minded, this may happen. And in the company, of course, I learned a lot about space mission that I never forgot. But in the same time, I could travel a number of times to America, in particular at NASA, in particular at NASA JPL and NASA Marshall Space Flight Center. And there I established very good connection that lasted even after I finally left my company. So I stayed in my company in Turin in between 85 and 2004, practically 20 years. After that, it just happened that my company was acquired by the French establishment, by a French company. And when that happened in a company, then all the senior people, so as to say, or higher level people, are asked to leave the company because the newer guy must be people faithful to the new establishment. So they offered me a good golden handshake, which I took. So I left my company at the age of 65, which is not bad at all. I could retire at my home, which is where you can see these images. And from that time on, I had much less money, but also 24 hours a day, free to do all kinds of research I wanted. So after 2004, I devoted all my time, first of all, to writing books. Books about what? Books about what I had been working on with new ideas like the focal space mission for the previous year, but I could not write at that time because I was a company employee. Now that I was no longer a company employee, I could write all I wanted to write, except, of course, for company matters like secrets and all that. This I would not be interested in break. I'm not a politician, I'm a scientist, and particularly a mathematician. So I'm a respectable person, I guess. And so I wrote books. Actually, the first book was about the KLT, called Telecommunications, KLT and Relativity, because just for fun, I worked out the relativistic theory of the KLT. That is, the KLT to find signals from relativistically moving objects. But that I wrote already before 94, so that is when I was still at my company. After that, I wrote this big book about the focal space mission, the sun as a gravitational lens. And, I was later surprised, for instance, to find out that at Harvard University in the United States, quite a few students in the astronomy department used my book, that book, as a textbook. So I was pleased about that. And after that, in 2012, I wrote the big book so far called Mathematical SETI. It's 700 pages of mathematics, so this is not a popular thing. There are 10 chapters devoted to the KLT, plus the first 12 chapters devoted to the Evo SETI theory and other topics. Okay, but you asked me about the KLT and who is using it and what happened with that. Well, I mentioned that my first book ever about the KLT, totally mathematical thing, was written by 1994. And now the unsold copies are sitting at the University of California at Berkeley, sold for free, practically, meaning that anyone picking up a copy can decide that this is a disgusting mathematical book and put it down again, or rather, say, okay, let me try to see if I can understand something out of all this. And that was my first book on KLT. Now I have to mention another important event that changed my life. I happened to discover that in my own country, Italy, which is certainly not as rich as the United States in funds for science, there was actually a small group of radio astronomers nearby Bologna, the town of Bologna in northern Italy, in a small village, country village called Medicina. Medicina has nothing to do with medicine or with the Medicis. It's simply the name of a country village outside, 30 kilometers outside Bologna, where the radio telescopes are. So anyway, I went there and I had been doing the KLT mathematics as part of my PhD thesis in London many years before, around 1980, 1991. So I was afraid that this serious radio astronomy could have turned me down, saying, oh no, look, this this is too much mathematical. We don't want that. We have the Fourier transform. It works wonderfully, so we don't want anything better. Well, I was wrong. Actually, I was very lucky in meeting a guy called engineer Stelio Montebugnoli, who was then the director of the radio telescopes at Medicina. And he said, okay, let's give this guy a try. Let's put some students work on this. And so in conclusion, in a short time, a few years, we had the first algorithm capable of being put up on computers that we had in order to do beginning of SETI by virtue of the KLT. So that was the beginning of my KLT interest in the 1990s, basically, with Stelio Montebugnoli. He and I are excellent friends, and we are still friends today, same age. I'm going to be 72 in January and in February, and he will be 72 in January. So that was the beginning. After that, both Stelio and I started to attend the meetings of the SETI committee of the IAA, held every year in a different place in the world during the IAC, International Astronautical Congress. And by attending this meeting, he and I came to know the whole small group of the international SETI community, starting with the teacher to all of us, Professor Frank Drake, a man that I can only respect 100% because he is not only excellent in science, but he is also excellent as a human person. He understands the people working hard. He tries to help them and encourage them. This is precisely what I've been trying to do also in later years with my pupils. So I owe this behavior to Frank Drake. And apart from Frank Drake, I also met with Jill Tarter, who was, quotes, I hope Jill doesn't mind if she hears that, the goddess of SETI worldwide. A fantastic lady, extremely determined to start SETI as a true branch of science, respectable science. Whereas at that time, there were still many people mixing up SETI with UFOs and all that. Next, on this, my first visit to the United States for SETI was in 1987, when I was still working with my company. I took a holiday, vacation, saying, I've never been to California, I want to see this fantastic country, and so I did. And I went to the NASA Ames Research Center, and I met, and this was another happy event, with Dr. Kent Cullers. Now, if you have been watching the movie Contact, you probably remember that there is a blind character in the movie called Kent. And this Kent is the person that Ellie Arroway, that in reality was actually Jill Tarter, because the novel Contact was written by Carl Sagan on the model of Jill Tarter as the real lady SETI radio astronomer. So anyway, I met with Kent, who was a real blind person in the SETI program, the first PhD blind guy in physics in the history of the United States. Fantastic person. As far as I can read in the internet, he's still alive, and I'm glad about that. I never met him anymore, but I owe Kent a lot of good suggestion and information about how to discover a SETI signal. Okay, so that was in this visit of mine to the NASA Ames SETI group in 87. And after that, I tried to meet them again as many times as possible during the IAC, as I said, but also around the world. In the meantime, I kept working in my company on space mission. And then obviously the relationship between the far side of the moon and the potential usefulness of that for SETI became obvious. In the 1990s, I had just as Frank Drake was my American teacher, so the French, Jeanette Mann was my French teacher. I also speak French, so I went many times to Paris. He was working at the Paris-Meudon Observatory nowadays in Paris, but at the origin in the outskirts of Paris. And Heidmann was the guy who told me, well, why don't we start a study about protecting legally the moon far side? So we did. And we wrote papers together, of course. We were working on the moon far side as early as 1995, roughly speaking. But then, unfortunately, I have to tell you a sad story, but this is part of life. In 99, the IAC conference was held in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, at the RAI Convention Center. And he approached me, Jan Heidman, and said, hey, the IAEA is asking me to appoint a deputy. Would you like to be my deputy? And I said, oh my, what shall I have to do with this position of your deputy? And I was very naive, I have to say it, and very honest. And he was very intelligent not to tell me the truth. And so he said, oh, you do nothing, I do everything. And so in conclusion, I was appointed his deputy. And that was in 99 in the Netherlands at the conference in Amsterdam. But what really happened was that he was already aware that he had cancer. And in less than a year's time, he passed away in the night between July 2nd and 3rd, 2000, in Paris. And so I had a message from Jill saying, Claudio, would you like to take up his cosmic study, that is the study of the protection of the far side of the moon? And I accepted. And from that time on, even nowadays, I am continuing this study. So this has been one of the main trends in my activities, that is to try to support legally the protection, at least of the central part of the far side, for SETI and for all kinds of radioastronomy. But let's go back to the KLT. When I finally left my company in the year 2004, because the French took over and there was another company, and I accepted the golden handshake, then I started getting acquainted with the Italian astrophysical community that earlier I could hardly have done because I was regarded as just, quotes, a guy working in a company, Whereas the university professor usually look down on these people working in companies from their point of view, because they believe that the people working in companies are not as learned, are good engineers, but not as learned as people holding chairs in academic establishment. So only at that time, that is after 2004, I could approach the Italian astrophysical community, and I was happy to meet Professor Giovanni Bignami from Milan, who I had met earlier, but when he realized the story, that is that I was just a modest poor guy, let me put it clearly, retired from a company, he said, oh, well, then you can join the National Institute for Astrophysics. We can cover your mission expenses. It's not a regular salary, but we can cover your mission expenses. And so this was wonderful. I met with him, and I was also lucky in that in the year 2008, Giovanni Bignami, nicknamed Nanni Bignami, was elected president of COSPAR. COSPAR, standing for Committee on Space Research, is one of the two largest organizations worldwide about space missions for science. So in this position, I was allowed to attend meetings because he appointed me his personal advisor. And so following him, I could attend meetings worldwide, could have my missions, at least in part, covered. And this is when I came to meet at the Medicina radio telescope, the larger radio telescope then in existence in Italy, the person that later was going to become the director of the Cagliari Observatory. Cagliari is the leading town in the island of Sardinia, the biggest island in the Mediterranean apart from Sicily. And this man is called Nicky D'Amico. I am not hiding anything. I am sure he may watch this video, but I have nothing to hide, nor he has nothing to hide. And so I could talk to him confidentially and with time about the KLT that we had already implemented at the Medicina radio telescope near Bologna with Stelio Montebugnoli and some students. And I am grateful to Nicky for understanding the power of this, just as Stelio had understood the power of this. It is so much better than the Fourier transform, and they realize so. In the meantime, as I mentioned earlier, Bob Dixon had come to the same conclusion in the United States and completely independently of us. But I have to be frank, the first person that understood the full power of the KLT was a third person, or if you prefer, a first person, the French François Biraud. He was working at Meudon Observatory with Jan Heidman, and he was the first person to publish ever about the KLT for SETI. You can find it in a paper in Acta Astronautica. Acta Astronautica is the journal of the IAEA, and the title is SETI et the Nancy Radio Telescope. Practically speaking, he meant the importance of the KLT with respect to the FFT for SETI. So that was the beginning. And when the Sardinia Radio Telescope was finally completed, around 2011 or so, Nicky D'Amico, who I had met in Medicina, invited me and covered my expenses several times to Sardinia. And so here is the important point. I could raise a school of KLT expert at Cagliari. Something that I would never have expected to become true, but it became true because those superior in hierarchy people, Stelio at Medicina and Nicky D'Amico in Cagliari, did help me a lot. So nowadays, there is a flowering community of about 20 or more young radio astronomers at Cagliari doing SETI with the KLT on the big 64-meter dish that now we have. It is called Sardinia Radio Telescope, nearby Cagliari, about 30 kilometers west of Cagliari. So this is the history of the KLT. And I have to mention at least three former students of mine that I trained in the difficult mathematics of the KLT, and now they are my successor in many regards. The first person that I have to mention is Dr. Niccolò Antonietti. He lives in Turin, as I'm living, and he was my best pupil when I taught a few times the courses about the KLT at Politecnico di Torino, the engineering school, named like the École Polytechnique in Paris, and he is still my best pupil about the KLT. So he and I have been publishing several papers on improvements about the KLT later on. Another person that I have absolutely to mention is now working at Cagliari at the observatory with the 64-meter dish, and he is Dr. Andrea Melis. He's doing actually in some sense the difficult part, meaning implementing the algorithms for the KLT on real machine, like the Sardinia Radio Telescope. And then I have to mention a third young man working at Cagliari also with the radio telescope, Matteo Trudu. He's young and bright, and also is working hard to implement the KLT for SETI research at Medicina. Now, I have also to say something else, that while I was traveling around, after I left my company, that is after the year 24, I could meet this very bright person called Andrew Simeon, who now is the director of the UC Berkeley SETI program called Breakthrough Listen, because they like to listen rather than to transmit, so it's all SETI and no METI. And also, I am grateful to Andrew for supporting 100% my research. We also went, a full team from the Sardinia Radio Telescope went to Berkeley in 2018, and we spent days, days working together. So I know them all. And one more person, please, that I have to thank a lot for his support, even before the advent of Breakthrough Listen, is Professor Dan Wertheimer at Berkeley University. Dan and I have been excellent friends for 30 years. We still are. So, I can count on them. And they are really people that help me, and I have been trying to help them as far as I could. So this is the good friendship that starts between SETI folks. I have also to mention, but it's much more recent time, China and Russia. So let me mention about Russia first. In Russia, the number one person that I had the honor and privilege to meet more than once, actually 4 times altogether, was academician Nikolai Kardashev, the discoverer of the Kardashev's classification of extraterrestrial civilizations, and the director of the Astrospace Center in Moscow for many, many years. He is the person who established the radioastron in Russian space mission, which is a big radio telescope orbiting the Earth. Not the first. The first one had been put up by the Japanese. It was called VSOP or Haika. So the Japanese were the first to set up a radio telescope in space, of course increasing the baseline, so improving the angular resolution on the targets that they were observing. Anyway, Kardashev was another wonderful person that I regret I couldn't stay with for a longer time. We met 4 times in all our lives. I say so because unfortunately he passed away, as I mentioned earlier, on August the 3rd this year. And actually, as a chair of the SETI committee, I'm glad that I could organize the commemoration of Kardashev during the SETI meeting that we had in Washington, D.C. on October 22nd, I guess. So anyway, October 23rd. So anyway, Kardashev was an excellent teacher. He invited me 2 times in Moscow. Once I gave my talk about the sun as a gravitational lens at the Sternberg Astronomical Institute in Moscow, that has always been the number 1 institution in the Soviet Union and then Russia to create good radio astronomers. And my talk was of course in English, but it was immediately translated by very willing people into Russian. So I had a full audience listening to my presentation of the Fokker space mission in Moscow years ago. And later I was there the second time in 2014 when the COSPAR conference was held in Moscow again. And for the first time in the history of COSPAR, Kardashev and I were able to ask for and obtain a half day, my God, they were not too generous, but a half day SETI session. And, I really owe Kardashev a lot of support. And this was the last time I met him. And I really am sorry that he is no longer with us. So, of course, he understood the importance of the KLT. So we talked also the Russian fellows about the KLT. So this is what the situation is. The KLT is currently being used mainly or originally by the KLT group at the Sardinia Radio Telescope in Italy, the school, let me say so. There are about 20 young folks involved with that. But also abroad, also at Berkeley, because, the unsold copies of my book, Telecommunication, KLT and Relativity, going back to 1994, were actually brought physically to Berkeley. They are being distributed. I wouldn't say sold because I'm making no money, but I'm not doing that for money. I do it for the science. So they are being distributed for free at the University of California at Berkeley. So many young American SETI astronomers came to pick up a copy, and even if they couldn't find immediately everything palatable because the mathematics is hard, nevertheless they know about the idea. So this is the KLT and who is using the KLT worldwide at the moment. Thank you.
Now, Doctor, in a broader sense, we have quite a few SETI experiments. You mentioned Berkeley, and then of course the Russians, and then the Allen Telescope Array. We have your group. We have a number of SETI experiments looking. Do you think, what's your own personal gut feeling? Do you think that we will discover evidence of a technological alien civilization anytime within the next 20 years, or is this something that could take centuries? That we look and look and look and maybe never find anything? Or do you think that maybe the Fermi paradox is not quite so not quite so restrictive in that we have a good chance of finding it. What's your personal view on that?
Well, I know that before myself there had been SETI astronomers saying, very likely in the next 20 years we are going to discover them. I'm really sorry to disagree with these colleagues, but honestly, I have no idea about how long it might take for us to detect an extraterrestrial civilization. And of course, there are a number of issues related to detecting an extraterrestrial civilization. How far are they? What is the frequencies that we should tune up our apparatuses to detect anything? Could we detect signals emitted by machines rather than by humans as we are? And so on and so forth. So honestly, it's beyond my reach to say it will take 20 years, a century, some centuries we will never find them or what. I don't know. We all work for the future. It could happen early, it could happen late, it could never happen. I don't know. We are just working for the future. Period.
Now, say it did happen, and say next week we detect an unambiguous technosignature of an alien civilization that, beyond all doubts, this is, we see a Dyson swarm or something like that that is clearly not natural. Now, we were talking earlier about religion, and that plays into this. What effects on society would you expect once we actually see an alien civilization? Is life going to just continue for everyone, and everyone will be just like, well, aliens, we always thought they were there. There they are. Or will there be upheaval over this?
I don't know. And I am concerned. With progress, cultural progress in humankind, I would try to rule out upheaval. Because upheaval is made by people who are fanatics in some belief, and they start to stop the people who are working in this field, even by violent means. But I don't think this is reasonable. This is too much pessimistic view. The minds of humans have been evolving towards progress and science enormously. And I am, of course, happy about that. I told you that when we were talking about the possible Russian signal, of course, the news spread out immediately worldwide. All TVs were talking about that. And actually, I was interviewed by the New York Times, and you can find my interview in the web. But I have to admit that the responsibility of the interviewer has grown up wonderfully well. They did not ask us, did you discover extraterrestrials? Which is the stupid question. We don't know. We have hints sometimes, but they may be wrong. And so I would rule out violent behaviors by anyone. What might happen is kind of more difficult opposition. Forget about the religious people, but from the politicians. Because, the next question would be, okay, we discover not only an extraterrestrial civilization, but suppose that we discover at least part of the message. Are we going to reply? And that is a difficult question. Carl Sagan wrote books, and one of the chapters is, who will speak for Earth? And this is difficult, politically speaking, because of course, the final decision goes to the politicians. I am not saying the SETI radio astronomers should decide. I am a respectable citizen of my country and of all countries. And if the politician will say, you shut up and you stop talking about that, I am afraid I would abide to this, because I don't want to create problem to anyone, including myself. But I am also optimistic that the future of humanity will reach a point sometimes where the politician will not ask us, shut up and don't do any more work in this field. So the point is to make education I wouldn't say the most important issue in SETI business, but one of the most important SETI business in SETI business, because education is bringing up the new generations. And let me please point out to you that I am glad, as chair of the SETI committee, that I could appoint some new members, not many, that there are about 100 members of the SETI committee right now, but some new papers that do not come from physics, mathematics, computer science, astrophysics, astrobiology, and all that. They come from the humanities. And that is good point, because we need the support, at least the moral support, if not technological support, from these people. And we have more people coming, as I mentioned, from the philosophy, from the humanistics, from history. Here I have to mention one great step ahead, in my opinion, that, frankly speaking, occurred only last year. That is bringing the community of big historians in touch with SETI experts. Now, what is big history? Big history is the history of science from the Big Bang up to now. So going through the whole spectrum from physics to biology, to sociology, to human upheaval, to human improvements, up to science, the science of SETI. And I was able last year in July 15, this year, we are talking about 2019. This year, July 15, 16, 2019 in Milan, with the kind of support from the Milan and the international SETI community, to gather the first conference, international conference, of course, about SETI and big history, or if you prefer, big history and SETI. So the people attending this conference, you can find, I can give you the web address, I did that already to you. You can find all the talks that were given on the web. So you can peruse and listen to talks ranging from technically matters to matters of how there were examples in human history of civilization with different level clashing against each other. Obviously, the most obvious example is when the Spaniards, Cortés, arrived in Mexico and they found a civilization that was technologically speaking less advanced than the Spanish one. But that was not the only case. Another case, of course, was when the Spanish arrived in today's Peru and they met the Aztecs and so on and so forth. But also other examples like what happened on Easter Islands is very significant, you know. There have been presentations in this Milan conference talking about what are the mysteries related to Easter Island, meaning that there was a time when flourishing civilization was on Easter Island. But then for whatever reason that we do not understand, they cut all trees, and so they committed suicide, practically speaking. I don't know whether that was done because of religious beliefs or whatever, but anyway, they committed suicide. And this we have to avoid. So, wrapping up, it's hard to say. What I'm trying to do is to increase the interest of humanistically minded people to SETI, to let them talk with the real SETI guys, because this can only enrich the culture of both the humanity guys and of the technically expert SETI guys. Thank you.
Now, there have been times in human history where it was essentially household knowledge that quote-unquote aliens exist. And I would cite Giovanni Schiaparelli's canals that he was describing on Mars that don't exist, that Percival Lowell later went and investigated further and saw them, and now we know they're not there. They were optical effects of the telescopes. But the point is, at the time, people thought, well, there are aliens on Mars. And this is not some distant star system. This was Mars, and they accepted that. Another example would be when pulsars were discovered. It was originally thought this is an alien civilization. Everyone just sort of said, well, okay. As long as it does not pose a threat, which it's hard to envision anything that would pose a threat over a distance of light years, I think human civilization will probably largely accept it. And even here in the United States, with people with the UFO phenomenon, a majority of people believe those things are something of alien origin. Of course, they are probably not, but they're simply unidentified. So it seems to me that society is a little bit more receptive to SETI, as you say, because of education. But even without it, I think people assume that there are alien civilizations out there, because what would this universe look like with all of the chances and stars for alien civilizations if we were the only one? And if we were unique, that in itself looks very strange. So it would naturally, you would think, there are alien civilizations all over the place. They may not exist at the same time. They may not exist close enough to detect, but chances are they're out there. So based on that, and things, for example, I know that the Roman Catholic Church said that we don't have a problem if they find aliens. So your sense is, in a nutshell, that it probably would not be a problem unless there was something about the signal or something that they were doing that seems to pose a threat to Earth. Say they were building a nickel Dyson beam or something like that and pointing it at us or something like that. So as long as it doesn't pose a threat, it's not going to upend society. Do you think that's a reasonable viewpoint?
Absolutely. You just said exactly what I think. Sorry, I have to correct a little misprint in Italian. The correct pronunciation is Schiaparelli, not Schiaparelli.
Schiaparelli.
Yeah, forget it. Okay. Now, anyway, yes, you're right. And I completely share your point. In all kinds, there has been a wonderful progress in the minds of the average people, average culturally learned people, towards admitting that extraterrestrial exist. The number one point that most people, not technically skilled people that I talked with, pointed out is that, there are so many stars, so many stellar systems, and now we know each or nearly each of them has planets too, by extrapolating what we have found already. So there are so many planets around that it's statistically impossible that we are alone. It's statistically impossible that, we are the only civilization in the galaxy. That is ridiculous. But that was the idea of someone in the past. And so the real point is to change our minds from the past to the future. And I'm glad that with the advent of internet, pretty obvious that many more people are willing to accept. The question of whether they are benign or not is another big question mark. I can tell you that most SETI researchers believe that they would be benign. So they would be more advanced than us, not only in the technological sense, but also in the social sense. And this in particular is the opinion of friend Drake, and I have been sharing this opinion since I met him 30 years ago for the first time.
Say, though, tying back to the singularity, can one know what the motivations of a machine civilization would be? Would they be benign? I mean, as biological beings, we can sit here and say, well, we can empathize, we can do all these things, and perhaps this is common in nature, these sorts of behaviors, but maybe not so much with a machine civilization. So should we detect situationally, again, a machine civilization that's, devouring star systems with von Neumann probes or something like that, some nightmare scenario? Is there anything in SETI, as you just sit and think about how this might unfold, that keeps you up at night? I mean, does anything that we might find out there bother you?
Well, the only thing that keeps me up at night, as it is now, it's nearly 12 midnight over here, it's research. And by research, I mean, in my case, trying to write mathematical equations that are as close as possible to physical reality. Anyway, going back to your question, Well, the obvious answer is I don't know. But again, I am confident in what Frank Drake taught to all of us. We are, in some sense, we are all pupils of Frank Drake. That is, if life has let us raise from an animal behavior to today's behavior, which is still animal, unfortunately, in part, but it is not only animal, so that there is goodwill, there is research, there is progress, there is anything you want to mention, including pacifism. I am certainly a pacific and supporter of no war anymore, as Carl Sagan was. So I am indebted not only to Frank Drake, but also to Carl Sagan in this regard. So anyway, the point is very simple. If the progress has been equally distributed in all aspects of life as we know it, it's impossible that they are violent and they want to exterminate us and they are a threat. It could happen, but I regard it as unlikely. Thank you.
All right, Doctor, we are out of time. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you for asking me so many pertinent questions. I'm really grateful to you, grateful to the people who are willing to listen to this long conversation. Again, I am basically an optimist. I've been trying to solve problems rather than create more problems. And only the future will tell whether what we have been doing will be of advantage for humanity sometimes in the future, as we all SETI scientists strongly believe. Thank you very much.
So how would you react? If everyone woke up to a news story announcing an unambiguous signal detection from the depths of deep space, how would it affect your life? Would you wonder what they were like, or would you not believe it at all? I think that most people on this world, regardless of what we felt about it, would just move on with their lives. I wouldn't. I'd make a ton of videos and conduct interviews on it. But for most, it would be a curiosity, unless it was really close. And what of the second detection? The third? The 500th? Would they even make the mainstream news? But as was mentioned in this interview, I think the real question comes down to whether we should respond to any message we receive that seems to be an intentional communication. Would a response expose our world to a security threat? Would a lack of a response be seen as a snub? Which is worse? Let us know what you think in the comments below.
John?
Yes, Anna?
Your Italian leaves much to be desired.
Better than my French. I didn't even learn how to pronounce my own last name correctly until I was 20.
I find that unsurprising.
What does that sound?
The oposssum's conducting an engine test, John.
What? Doesn't sound like a rocket. Sounds like a LeBaron firing up.
Modern technology, John.
This is why we can't have nice things. And on that note, join us next week for a discussion with Dr. James Annis of Fermilab and a discussion of their work in cosmology. See you then.